Just 10 days ago, we celebrated St. Valentine's Day. I'm calling this message True Love, not because of the romantic ideal of love that Valentine's Day conjures up, but more in spite of it. Last Sunday, we taught from this same chapter, chapter 6 of Luke, and we saw the part of, anyway, the first half of what Jesus said to the crowd on the plain somewhere outside of Capernaum. There's one dramatic difference between this Sermon on the Plain and what we commonly know as the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. Now, I don't usually do this, but I'm assuming you all just opened up to Luke 6 or you have it in some form. I'm wondering if you're fast enough to turn pages. Did you notice what the difference is? What's the dramatic difference between what happens in Luke 6, and I'll clue you in. It's Luke 6, verse 17, and Matthew 5, verse 1. What's the big difference between those two passages? And anyone who gets it gets a special candy bar at coffee hour. Anyone got an idea what the big difference is between those two sentences?
Yeah.
Say it. He went up in one, he went down in the other. Yeah, that's true. There's another major difference. Ah, very good. Give the lady the candy bar. We actually have, for anyone who wants them, someone run in punchkis, which everyone knows is the Polish word for donut. So you get a donut afterward. Yeah, and punchkis are really great. All right, so Jesus, in Matthew 5:1, it says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them. There, in Matthew's telling of it, in Matthew 5:1, Jesus was creating an open-air synagogue, okay? He sat down to teach them. Now, nothing of the sort is happening here in the sermon, in what's commonly called the Sermon on the Plain. That's one of the reasons why I think that these are two different experiences, two different moments. In Luke 6:17, it says, he came down with his newly minted disciples, they'd been traveling together, and he stood on a level place. Verse 19 tells us that the crowd pressed in on him because they wanted to be healed of their diseases, just as they had seen him doing down in Capernaum. I said last week that when you leave Capernaum in any direction, unless you're getting on a boat, you're headed uphill, okay? And so in order for them to have gotten to a level place, they had to have climbed this very steep hill that comes out of the town of Capernaum. And by the time they found a level place, they were some distance from town, all right? That's not all that important, but it is true. Jesus doesn't sit down here in order to offer commentary on the word. That's what a rabbi would do in a synagogue, and that's what Jesus did in Matthew 1. When he sat down, he was acting as a rabbi in an open-air synagogue because he was going to give commentary on the scriptures. And most authors that I've read believe that the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount is a commentary on the Ten Commandments. You can go diving into that one for yourself. It's really interesting to try and find out where all of that material is in what they call Jesus' commentary. But he stands here in Luke. He stands, and this is a completely different kind of a scene. He stands basically barking out orders, if you will, to his apostles in the midst of this enormous crowd that has come up from Capernaum. This moment's not nearly as orderly as you would expect from somebody who was preaching in a synagogue. In a synagogue, you would read the scriptures. We saw Jesus do this a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at Luke 4. You'd read the scriptures, you'd sit down on the bema, and a chair, and you would give commentary on the scriptures. That was the way synagogue was done in those days. Nothing like that's happening here. This is more like a controlled riot, really. And Jesus is telling his apostles, he's having to call it out. He says to his apostles, love the blessed busted, love the blessed brokenhearted, love the blessed bound. That's what he's doing. He's yelling it out. He's also warning those who are coming to him merely for physical healing. You rich, woe to you, you raucous, woe to you, you rising, right? From last week, the 6 categories that we had last week in the message. These are people who are not likely, actually, when you think about it, to even hear what Jesus is saying. Imagine being in a crowd of several hundred, maybe several thousand people. Remember, groups of over 1,000 were not rare at this point in Jesus' ministry. Remember how many he fed twice? 4,000, 5,000? That was just counting the men. Okay, so we know that large crowds were coming, and it's like the whole town of Capernaum probably came up and climbed that mountain, all the able-bodied and even some of those who weren't, climbed the mountain to get up to the plain where Jesus was going to talk to them. The only problem is that they started crushing in around him. He doesn't get the chance to sit down and teach. That's not what's happening here. And they're coming to Dr. Jesus. That's the way that they look at it. They think they're all set except for some physical ailment that they've got. And they're coming to Dr. Jesus, willing to pay whatever money he requires, just like they do all the other faith healers. This healing will ensure that they retain their wealth. This healing will ensure that the party keeps on rolling. And if they can just get healed, it will ensure that they keep on climbing the social ladder. That's what at least some of the people had come for. So Jesus calls out loudly. I want to try an experiment with you. I don't know if you can do this. I want to see just how flexible you are. This is fun with a small group of people, really. I want you to sound like you're a large throng of people, all right? And I want you to make as much noise as you can. I don't mean clapping. Enough talking noise. Pretend you're trying to talk in a restaurant and you're talking over each other. So just start conversing as loud as you can, okay? Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are brokenhearted. Blessed are the bound. Woe to you, rich. Woe to you, raucous. Woe to you, rising. Okay, you can stop. How many of you actually heard what I said? No one. And the fact is, here's a crowd of people. There's thousands of people probably around Jesus. And they're crushing in because they want to touch him. They want to touch him. They want to get as close as they possibly can to Jesus. Because they've heard that when they touch Jesus, power goes out from him. And the power automatically heals all diseases. I don't think they heard anything. I don't think that they heard him yelling out, woe to you, rich. Woe to you, you raucous, you partiers. Woe to you, you social climbers. So here, Jesus sounds more like the town crier back in colonial America than he does like a proper first century Jewish rabbi. It's just not happening that way. So the next thing he says, though, is really stunning when you think about it, because he's got this crowd crushing in on him, and no one's hearing anything, right? And he goes, he's probably hoarse at this point. He goes, but I say to you who hear. Isn't that ridiculous? At that moment, I say to you who hear, who's listening? Remember, Jesus is struggling to keep a mob orderly here. They are pressing in on him. So who then is Jesus saying this to? But I say to you who hear. Who's he saying that to? Well, he's saying it to the whole crowd, actually. in this case, again, a distinction between this and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, he's saying it to the whole crowd. He's not singling out his disciples. In Matthew 5, it says he called his disciples to them and had them sit down around him as he sat and taught, because he understood in Matthew 5 that they were the ones for whom the message was aimed. All right. In particular, anyway. So think of it. If this was aimed at the 12, if this was the equivalent of Matthew 5, were the 12 at this moment in Jesus' ministry, were they particularly needy? Were the 12 particularly brokenhearted? Were the 12 particularly imprisoned? No, not at this moment. That all happens later. In fact, somebody asked Jesus once why his disciples ate and drank and enjoyed themselves and had good times and parties together. And he answered them that they should rejoice while the bridegroom is with them. But in a crowd of several thousand, you can be assured all 6 of these groups, the brokenhearted, the bound, the rich, the raucous, and the rising, as I said last week, would be represented. They'd all be there. And so Jesus shouts out, "But I say to you who hear." This has always been a problem for the church, what I'm about to tell you. It was a problem in Jesus' day. It was a problem throughout the time of the kings of Israel. It was a problem when Israel was in Sinai. It was a problem when Israel was in Egypt. It was a problem for the patriarchs. It was a problem in Eden. This is a human problem I'm going to tell you about. But this is a church problem. Here it is. When Jesus says, "I say to you who hear," our problem so much of the time is that we won't hear. Or maybe especially when it's incredibly important that we do hear, we shut our ears and we say, "I won't." In other places, Jesus says it this way. He says, "Let him who has ears to hear, hear." That's Matthew chapters 11 and 13, Mark 4, Luke 8 and 14. It's all over those places. The glorified Christ says this to each of the 7 churches that he calls out in Revelation, as St. John writes it. He says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches." And I'd reference again to you Paul writing to his student pastor Timothy in 2 Timothy 4. "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions." I don't want to hear that. The church problem is one of the most human of problems. Most people don't want to listen. Most people want to talk. Most people want to hear their own voice. The people in the crowd in Luke 6 were pressing in on Jesus, and they were all probably talking at once. And he told them how to go beyond circumstance and how to trust the good news, the euangelion, that they could be partakers of the kingdom of God. That's why he was there. That's what he was trying to communicate. But what do you suppose any of those 6 groups actually heard? Understand, I'm including those that he says are blessed. I'm including them along with the woes together, all 6 groups. What do you think they actually heard of his message? Then he said, "I say to you who hear." Did you? Did you hear? Or after 4 weeks of working on this one word, I keep bringing it up, euangelion. After 4 weeks, can you still not repeat it without having it written down in front of you? Let's see. John was talking on Sunday about some Greek word. Oh, what was that word John kept saying? Sounds like evangelical. See, listening takes work. What has God's Spirit been saying to this church over the past 6 weeks? Because it was about 6 weeks ago that I first noticed that people were showing up 20 minutes, a half an hour late. Fewer people were attending at worship. About 6 weeks ago. What has he been saying to this church over the past 6 months? Because that's when some of the excitement, some of the air went out of the balloon. What has the Spirit of God been saying to this church over the past 6 years? Because it was at least that long ago that Brian first told me that we had a leaky roof. I've been wrestling this out. I know some of you have been too. You hear the noise of the crowd pressing in on Jesus just the same as they did on the plain that day outside of Capernaum. Only today the noise is the noise of there's not enough money. That noise. Today the noise is so many of us are sick or old or dying or dead or indifferent or simply absent. That noise. Today the noise is the building leaks and the heat doesn't work right, and this isn't the right space for the church that we are today, but we're stuck with it. That noise. What do you hear of Jesus' message when we put it in those terms? Jesus called out, "Blessed, blessed, blessed." But how many people actually heard what he was saying? And he also called out, "Woe, woe, woe." And how many people actually were listening to his warning? The great crowd just wanted their quick fix. I know you're hearing the same noise I'm hearing, most of you. But are you listening to Jesus? Want a shock? Somebody was listening that day outside of Capernaum. Do you know how I know that? I don't know who it was. I really don't. See, Luke 6:19, if you've got your scriptures in front of you, says, "All the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him, and he healed them all." And I'm left doubting whether 5 minutes later anybody in the crowd could have told you what it was that Jesus had said. The crowd just kept pressing in on Jesus, and he kept calling out blessings and woes until he was hoarse and probably sounded like a presidential candidate the first week of November. The crowd kept pressing in on him. Think of a rock star or a celebrity being crowded by autograph hounds. That kind of commotion. It's in the midst of this nearly uncontrollable situation that Jesus gives the crowd 3 stunning, and I'll admit counterintuitive, principles for life in the church. And I say for life, for church life, because only somebody who's really listening to Jesus would ever dare to do any of these 3 things, let alone all of them. And Jesus has chosen the craziest place that I can think of to communicate 3 really important principles for successful living. On the plain, open air, large crowd pressing in on him, and he's going to say something really important. Now, let me just pause and say that I've told you this many times before. So hopefully you'll remember my having said this, okay? And it is. Science has demonstrated that there is a 10% chance that you will remember a message that you've heard once. If you hear the same message in short order, the percentage chance that you will remember that message jumps to 30%. But if you hear the same message 3 times in quick succession after a pause, the chance that you're going to remember that message jumps to 90%. That's what I've been told. I learned it before there was an internet. I have no reason to doubt it, but I've never found the source. I've never gone looking for the source on that one. So you're welcome to prove me wrong if you'd like. Everything that you read on the internet is true. Here's how I know what I said a minute ago. Somebody, somewhere in that unruly, noisy crowd, there was someone who listened to Jesus. To me, the most interesting feature of verses 27 to 36 is that paragraph, is that Jesus said the same 3 things 3 times. He said the same 3 things 3 times in that brief paragraph. And somebody, I don't know who it is, you'll never find out who it was, listened. The reason I know that, think of that. No internet, no print media, no recording method of any kind. There wasn't even a person sitting at a table with a pen and paper to write it down. And someone remembered what Jesus said that day. And someone communicated that years later to a Syrian Christian named Luke, somebody who lived way up in Syria, way outside of this experience. Someone who probably, almost assuredly, never met Jesus. Somebody communicated that message to Luke years later. And years after that, probably, Luke wrote down that message in what we call a gospel and mailed it to a man who was a minor Greek official someplace over in Greece, even further away, a man named Theophilus. And that's how you and I heard this message. It took 3 people being faithful to communicate this message so that you and I would hear it. What I'm trying to say is that these 3 points must be really important in God's economy for Christians to know and live by. If you want to be part of a really successful church, Theophilus learned it from Luke, who learned it from someone who was there. Get everyone in the church to do these 3 things. Most of all, get them all to listen. So I ask you, are you listening this morning? Do you see what I see in the 6 groups that are there? It's a setup for us. It's in Jesus' message to a fragile church about to be born. The message that could easily have been forgotten that day, except that someone was listening. Someone in that great crowd heard what Jesus said. Do you see what I see? Are we as a congregation broke? Yeah, well, nearly so. Are we as a congregation brokenhearted? Absolutely. Are we as a congregation bound by things for which perhaps there are no human solutions? Probably. I know that my cleverness has not sufficient insight to be able to see how Jesus can break those chains. I know that he can. But that's us. We're the broke. We're the brokenhearted. We are the bound. And yesterday somebody asked me, what does your church have to celebrate? It's a good question. And I believe that if we'll live our brokenness, if we'll live our brokenheartedness, and if we'll live our boundness authentically and openly before one another, before God, and before the world if we have to, there is much to celebrate in a small, brokenhearted, bound church. There's much to celebrate. But when I think of celebration, I'm usually led to think of the massive check that arrives just when you were down to your last dime, and everyone celebrates it. I'm led to think of the happy party feeling of a large church singing and rejoicing with great musical style. I'm led to think of the dynamic rising leaders who offer grand visions of what a church can be or what it is. Are you listening? The sweetness of what God is doing among us these last 6 years, more so these last 6 months, and most of all these last 6 weeks, the sweetness of it is partly that the rich, the raucous, and the rising are almost totally absent from our midst. Now, don't become proud of our situation. That's not something to celebrate in itself, but it lends to the sweetness of who we are because it's not diluted by their presence. Here briefly then is what Jesus told those who would listen. Here's the message. And here's what he wants us to do. 1, this is our response, by the way, to what he's just said. You are broke, you are brokenhearted, and you are bound. 1, love the people you hate. This is first a bit of advice. Love the people you hate. 2, do good to the people who hate you. 3, lend or give, whichever you like, without expecting anything in return. Now, the first time that Jesus says these 3 things, I think he's speaking prophetically about what people are going to do to him. So I think it's verse 26, right, where the passage starts. He says, love your enemies, right? That is, love people that you personally, and this is the way that sentence actually reads in the Greek, love people you personally have a visceral, emotional, or maybe even spiritual dislike for. Love people whose whole framework for living is repugnant to you. Love those who press in on you because being near you heals people. Just by being near you, people are healed. Not because they care a whit about you. Love those people. Would you still heal people who didn't care about you? Would you still heal people that you had a moral revulsion against? Because that's exactly what Jesus was doing. Do good to those who hate you. That's the second thing. The adulation of the crowds lasts only as long as the healing and the feeding continues. Remember, there's only 4 days between Palm Sunday and Good Friday. Just about 100 hours between blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the huge throngs, and crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, same throngs. Would you still do good to people who turn on you so easily? He also says, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. It's prophetic. Matthew 27:44 says that the 2 criminals who were hung on either side of Jesus heaped insults on him on the cross. The Pharisees mocked him. Pilate mocked him. Would you bless those, knowing that in short order they'd be humiliating you? Would you pray for them, knowing that they would turn on you so violently? And the crowd kept pressing in on Jesus to be healed of their diseases. And still Jesus kept on uninterrupted, unperturbed. Point 3, to the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from one who takes away your cloak, don't withhold your tunic either. When Jesus was being tried, and I put that in quotes because it's not a real trial, when he was being tried before Caiaphas, the high priest, he answered each and every question truthfully. But his answers so offended the soldiers that John tells us one of the officers standing by struck Jesus on the face with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" And then they stripped him of his tunic and cast lots to see who would get the tunic, and they left him there standing there naked as a public embarrassment. And believe me, it's a horrible embarrassment. Nudity is a horrible embarrassment to the Jews. At verse 32, Jesus repeats what he had just said. I call it the second iteration. He repeats what he just said, except this time it's not prophetic. He says, "If you love those who love you, what benefit is it to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners and get back the same amount." The final thing that he's saying here is to the crowd. Okay? This second iteration, rather, is to the crowd. He's saying it to all. The final, most condensed iteration of this, I believe Jesus is saying to whoever that person was, or whoever the people were who actually heard. I think that's the third iteration. It's in verse 35. Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. It's as short as it possibly can. It's memorable. It's memorizable. All the other stuff he'd said, the prophetic version is really long. The version he says to the crowd is a throwaway because it's also fairly long. This is condensed. Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And by the way, he said the same substantial message within about 5 minutes to everybody. And somebody's ears perked up and they heard. Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. That's the one that's really for those who were listening. That's the one that really caught the attention of that someone who told it to Luke, who wrote it to Theophilus. And that's the one that we need to write down and live. If we will do these three things and practice them as a congregation, I guarantee you we will be freed. We'll be freed in our brokenness. We'll be freed in our brokenheartedness. We'll be freed in our boundness. Why freed in and not freed from? Why did I say freed in and not freed from? Because Jesus didn't say that the goal of being a church together is to be wealthy, happy, or successful. And Jesus didn't say that if we follow him, all our problems will suddenly go away. He said that those who live on account of the Son of Man, do you see that phrase? Who live on account of the Son of Man, will rejoice in that day and be glad, for their reward is great in heaven. These three things are the prescription for what ails us. They are also the prescription for what ails every church. They are, in fact, how you listen well. Love people you would naturally exclude. In a small church, you'd think, well, everyone loves everyone else. We kind of have to, right? No. There's a lot of room for growth on that one, even in a fellowship our size. But I can tell you that the road to release is in the application of the principle. The road to release from hating people is in the application of the principle. Love those who hate you, because you have to listen to those you hate. Listen to those you hate. You have to include them. Second, do good to those who hate you. This one's even harder than the first. It's kind of easy, actually, to fake feelings of inclusion than it is to do good to somebody who's already turned on you. In the first group, all you have to do is kind of put aside your agenda, take a deep breath and dive in and include somebody and then listen to them. That's easy. But when somebody's already done you harm, turning around and with the next breath saying, I'm going to give to you, I'm going to serve you, I'm going to do for you, do good actively for you, even though you have harmed me. That's harder. And in order to have a heart that is going to do that, you have to listen to that person as well. Because the reason why they harmed you is, well, I don't know, it's different in different situations, but I can tell you, you'll never find out what the reason they harmed you was unless you listen to them. Third, lend without interest. This is an easy one, right? Unless you think that you need to hang on to every penny, every item, everything for fear that there won't be enough. Keep checking your bank account, church, and you'll never be free. But keep checking in with people. Keep listening to people. Keep hearing what their needs actually are, not what they presume their need to be. Keep hearing what their life is telling you that their needs actually are, and you will be in a better place to give. Give, and Jesus says, and expect nothing back, because when you listen to people well, you're not expecting a return. You're giving because it's a genuine need that they have, not just something you want to impress them with. The road to release is in the application of the principle, and the principle is, I say to those who hear. Are you listening? How do you need to apply these words? How do you need to apply them to your life? I can't tell you. Each of us is different. All I can say is what Jesus said. I say to those who hear. Let's pray.